Hello everyone, and welcome to our final lecture of History of the USA, when we're going to discuss the domestic policy of the US since World War II. And well, let's begin. So first, let us discuss the background, which is going to be pretty similar to what we have discussed last week. As you know, the US was a winner after World War II. They were the number one military and the number one economic power. They were producing 50% of everything that was produced of goods after World War II, so they were pretty dominating economically, and they were dominating militarily as well. They became a superpower in a bipolar world. So from the three points of the triangle, National Socialism, Communism, and Democracy, Communism and democracy remained, and the US became the leader of one of the blocs. The US also had a nuclear monopoly at the beginning, so they were militarily by far the strongest power. Well, as far as economics is concerned, the Great Depression was over. Although FDR's policies, the New Deal, contrary to what a lot of people said at the time, and some historians believe even today, lengthened the Great Depression. The Great Depression was finally over after World War II. And many people were talking about the American century, meaning they believe that the US is going to be dominating after this. And the big question was whether to revert to peacetime economy and risk another depression, or to keep up wartime production. If you remember, I told you that during the war, the US economy was largely ramped up by the government, and there was almost full employment because a lot of people, men went to war, and this is basically the situation at the time. And a lot of people felt that the result of World War I was the Great Depression, and they felt that if the US keeps up the wartime production, they might be able to avoid another depression. So the solution was to stay active on the world stage instead of isolationism, to start the Cold War, or at least to be in the Cold War against the Soviet Union, meaning to keep up wartime production. So basically, this is continuous after World War II. The US never decreased the military production after World War II considerably, so they still continued producing weapons at a massive scale. As you hopefully remember from last week, the president at the end of World War II was Harry Truman, who was the vice president of FDR and took over after he passed away. So one of the big issues after World War II was unemployment. Veterans return, what shall they do with them? Well, actually the fact was that women and black people who took the place of white men were often dismissed, so let go from the companies after the war, because the white men who came back took their original jobs back. But luckily there was economic growth, so the unemployment dropped quickly. So shortly afterwards, a lot of these people could go back to work. So Truman introduced a reform program, the Fair Deal. As the name also suggests, the Fair Deal was modeled on the New Deal. So what did this include? First of all, it included support for farmers. In the farming sector, the agriculture was still not doing that well, and Truman wanted to give them support. Also, housing and urban development. He wanted to have government build houses for poor people. Also federal aid to education on like primary, secondary, as well as the university level. He also wanted to pass a national healthcare legislation, um, which would have provided healthcare benefits to all Americans, but Congress doesn't pass it. So by this time there was a Republican Congress, and they were fed up with the increasing power of the government during World War II, so they rejected these reforms. The question after this, I mean, there were many questions in American society, but one of the questions was, what happens to women? What happens to women after they started working during World War II, whether they are going to go back to the home to be homemakers primarily, or whether they're going to stay active on the job market. And the fact is that this was only resolved later in the 1960s. So another important issue was race relations. Why was this important, or why does this come up? If you remember, I told you after World War I that it is often after wars that minorities and women have an improvement in their position, because war is the great equalizer. In the military, it doesn't matter whether you're black or white. What matters is how many stripes you have on your shoulder pad. And especially after World War II, this was important because a lot of the black people who were fighting in the US military in Europe were greeted by the French and by the Europeans as saviors, as liberators, and they were treated very respectfully as heroes. And then when they get home, they have to sit at the back of the bus, and they are discriminated against because they're black. So this is a big wake-up call, or an eye-opening experience for a lot of African Americans. And also it was under Truman that the military became desegregated. It was one of the first federal institutions that was desegregated, so there were no longer separate black and white units. Also important events took place in sports. Sports became another thing that became desegregated. And if you think about it, it makes sense why. Because it's the same as in the military, it is the rank that counts. In sports, what they should be looking for is to hire the best athletes. So all it needed was one person to break this, this barrier. And after that, if the other teams want to keep up with them, well, they have to hire blacks as well. So Jackie Robinson is very, very important because he was the first African-American baseball player in Major League Baseball. He was a player for the Brooklyn Dodgers. If any of you are interested, there is the movie 42, which is about his life. It is actually I think 6 or 7 year old movie. It's not bad. So, and Jackie Robinson was treated as a second-class citizen. He couldn't go to the same dressing room in the South as his teammates and so on. So he was still a legend, and he's still a legend in baseball. So in sports and in the military were the first steps towards desegregation. But as you'll see, the real fight for black equalities happened later. So the next president after Truman was Eisenhower, who was a Republican. He was a president from 53 until 61. Eisenhower was a war hero. He was generally respected by the whole American society, and he usually presented himself to be above political battles. It was his vice president, Nixon, who later became president in the late 60s, who was taking the everyday political debates instead of him. During this time, the economic growth continued, and we are talking about the fourth phase of the Industrial Revolution. This period is characterized by welfare, by mass production, by the appearance of suburbs. People moved out to the suburbs because most people had cars by now, so they didn't necessarily have to live in a city center if they wanted to commute to work. And this is also the time of baby boom. Baby boom is the sudden increase in the number of children. This is the most numerous generation of the United States so far. I think it's easy to imagine what happens. The husband was away at war, and then he comes home, and well, obviously he's been away for years, and then suddenly the number of children rises. But also, people, because this was a safe period, relatively stable in spite of the fears of the Cold War, but economically stable period. And then people were not afraid to have children. But this is also, there was also social criticism against this period, because this is a time of this is a rather conservative era, and a lot of people felt that minorities are not treated the way they should be, and also that people are just becoming cogwheels in a machine instead of being individuals. This, as I mentioned, is the fourth industrial revolution. The most important goods produced were cars, planes. This is a time when aviation, commercial aviation, became big, and also electronic goods, especially like radios, television, and so on. So there was also a change in the culture. Rock and roll became big. Of course, the biggest star of rock and roll was Elvis Presley, and Elvis introduced rock and roll to a lot of people. And also, this is the beginning of television. Well, if you ask your parents whether they had a TV growing up, I think a lot of them didn't. At least, in my family, my dad's family didn't have a TV, my mom's family did. But in the United States, by the beginning of the 1960s, so at about the time when like some of our parents were born, or maybe your parents weren't even born, 80% of households had at least one television set. This changed entertainment, but it also changed politics. The first presidential debate that was shown on television was the Nixon-Kennedy debate. And many political scientists say that it was this TV debate that meant that Kennedy won the presidency, because people who listened to it on the radio said that Nixon was better, and people who watched it on TV said that Kennedy was better. Kennedy was just better on TV, better looking, and so on. So this is the Nixon-Kennedy debate, the first televised presidential debate. Also, this is a period of anti-communism. So the second Red Scare already started during the time of Harry Truman. This is when the second Red Scare took place. The Red Scare was a fear and persecution of communists. The first Red Scare happened after World War I, and the second Red Scare after World War II. Obviously the reason for the second Red Scare was that the Soviet Union was gaining ground everywhere, and communism, like in Europe as well as in the Far East. And actually, it must not be forgotten that there were indeed really communist spies in the United States. The Rosenberg trial was an important trial when actually a couple was sentenced to death for espionage. A lot of people were outraged by this, but in reality, they really were spying on the US for the Soviet Union. So this was a very controversial case. Also, a committee was set up in the US Congress. One of the leaders of the witch hunt against communists was Joseph McCarthy, or also called Joe McCarthy, and they call this McCarthyism after his name. What is this McCarthyism about? It's about the hunt after communists, sometimes unjustified, sometimes justified. And they also established this House Committee on Un-American Activities. So a lot of people consider this to be a witch hunt, because they were often going after people who were not really communists, but they were just maybe a little bit more left-leaning, or political opponents, and often Hollywood actors and so on. And eventually even Eisenhower had enough of it. So in the mid-1950s, the anti-communist Red Scare started to die off and die down. But to a certain extent, anti-communism continued until the end of Cold War. So what about race relations? There was a very important Supreme Court case in 1954. This was the Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka County. I'm pretty sure that most of you remember this from cultural institutions, but just in case. Topeka County is in Kansas, and in Kansas there was segregation. Segregation was constitutional according to a previous decision of the Supreme Court almost 60 years before, the Plessy versus Ferguson case, which said that segregation between blacks and whites is constitutional if it is separate but equal. But in 1954, the Supreme Court declared that if it is separate, it cannot be equal. The issue was that Mr. Brown's, who was an African American, his child Linda Brown wanted to go to school on the other side of the street, but the school was not for black children, it was a white school, so she had to get on a bus and go to school in a different town. And this is why Mr. Brown went to court. And then this is when the Supreme Court declared this unconstitutional. So this meant that segregation in schools had to end. But this was moving very slowly. It took another at least 10 years before every school was integrated in the United States. And very often this required intervention by the federal government. Another important event in 1956-57 was a more than 400-day boycott, the Montgomery bus boycott. This was one of the leaders of this was Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks was an African-American lady, and she was a seamstress. And in Montgomery, Alabama, black people were required to sit at the back of the bus. And Rosa Parks refused to sit at the back of the bus one day when she was coming home from work very tired, and she was thrown off the bus because she didn't want to do this, and then she was fined, which she refused to pay, so she was eventually jailed for this fine. And this led to a big uproar, and a lot of African American organizations and pro-civil rights organizations went to Montgomery, and they organized a bus boycott, which means that black people and people who support the blacks were refused to ride on the public transportation system until it is desegregated. And this lasted for more than 400 days. And one of the leaders of this was Martin Luther King Jr., one of the leaders of the boycott, a Baptist preacher, about whom we're going to talk on the next slide. And just to close down this Eisenhower period, the Eisenhower period ended in '61 when Kennedy was elected. And very interesting that Eisenhower, on his farewell speech, he warned against the military-industrial complex, that it was dangerous. What is the military-industrial complex? It is basically a pressure group by the military and the industry that serves the military, producing planes and so on. And he was warning that they were becoming too powerful, and they were also endangering, influencing American foreign policy. The 1960s is often called WWII decade because of the many movements that were happening there. Let's begin with probably the biggest one, the civil rights movement. The aim of the civil rights movement was to end the Jim Crow laws, to end segregation, to end the discrimination in the South against African Americans, and to achieve full equality. Well, the most important figure here was Martin Luther King Jr., who was the leader of the peaceful wing of the civil rights movement. The peaceful wing was larger. They employed non-violent means to achieve their goals. For example, protests, boycotts, like the Montgomery bus boycott. They also had sit-ins. Sit-ins meant that black people would go to restaurants where black people would normally not be served and peacefully sit down and ask to be served. If they were refused, they just remained there until they were served. If they were thrown out, they would not resist physically, but then they would come back the next day until they were served. So this was a form of non-violent protest. They also had freedom rides, which meant that people from the North, mostly white young people, students who were sympathizing with the struggle of the Southern blacks, came down to help. And also it often happened that blacks and whites were riding in the same bus, which was, of course, against segregation. They were following the principles of Mahatma Gandhi, the Indian, the hero of Indian independence, and Thoreau, about whom you've heard. I think he was also preaching non-violence and resistance to the government. And Martin Luther King was the leader of this movement. MLK was a Baptist preacher, a Protestant preacher, so he was very close to traditional American values. And he was also a very smart man. He went to university when he was 16, and he received a PhD. So he was really, really smart guy. And he was also, the leader of many movements, including the March on Washington, which is one of the biggest protests in American history. And this is when he had his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. What was this "I Have a Dream" speech about? Basically, here he was appealing to American values. He was saying that America is about freedom and equality of opportunity. And when the founding fathers wrote the Declaration of Independence, they were promising an ideal, and that black people should not be allowed not to participate in this. So he was basically appealing to American values, showing that he's a good American, and that people should be, like black people should also be allowed to participate in the American dream. Unfortunately, Martin Luther King was assassinated in 1968 by white supremacists. Before that, he received the Nobel Peace Prize as well, and now he's, I think, the only American who has a holiday in his name. Another leader was Malcolm X. Malcolm X was one of the leaders of the violent wing. We have to understand that the violent wing was not unified. Okay, so there were many competing groups. Malcolm X was one of the leaders. He was compared to Martin Luther King. He was a Muslim. He chose to be a Muslim because he wanted to reject Christianity, which he considered to be the white man's religion. He also adopted this X in his name. His original name was Malcolm Little, because he said that X symbolizes the original slave African name that was lost in history. So Malcolm X was also assassinated, but he was not assassinated by a white supremacist, but by an even more radical black person who was against Malcolm X, because towards the end of his life he started to open up towards white people, like, saying that, like, maybe not all of them are so terrible. Some other movements were the Black Panthers, who were a paramilitary movement. You can see some of them here. They were, openly carrying weapons, and they said that because the police doesn't protect them, they are going to protect the black community themselves. And also the black Muslims, who were basically, they still exist, but who symbolized, as Malcolm X did, like rejecting Christianity and rejecting Judaism, because they said that Islam is the religion of the non-white people. So the violent wing mostly rejected American values. Just like Malcolm X said, he said that white people are never going to accept blacks until they stand up for themselves and fight. So, yeah, we'll see what were the results soon. So in the 1960s, there was not only the civil rights movement, but there were other movements. One of them was the anti-war movement. The Vietnam War was raging, people were affected, and a lot of young people rejected the war and were protesting against it. One of this was draft resistance. You can see here, like, the bearded, long-haired gentleman is burning the draft. The draft was basically like calling them in to fight in the war, and a lot of people resisted this, which was punishable by prison. So a lot of them ended up escaping the country to Canada. The anti-war movement linked up with other movements, including the students' movement, and also a lot of the rock and roll artists participated in the anti-Vietnam War movement. The most important and best known example of this is the Woodstock Festival, which was a big festival basically against the war, but a lot of people participated. And there were many protests on campuses. The most notorious one is the one that happened at Kent State in 1970, which resulted in a clash between the students and the National Guard, who were called there to keep up the order, but eventually they ended up firing into an armed crowd because of a misunderstanding, and unfortunately several students were killed. And this was a very notorious event. But eventually, the anti-war movement had a great part in the fact that the US had to finish the war, thank God. Also related to this was the counterculture. These were people who rejected American culture and capitalism. They were experimenting with, socialist communes, or they were rejecting American values and so on. This is basically the sex, drugs, and rock and roll culture. Like hippies and all kinds of weird cults were involved in this. They were rejecting basic American values and trying to experiment with something else. Also important in the 1960s was the women's movement. The big question, as I said, was whether to work or to stay home. An important organization that emerged was the National Organization of Women, or NOW, and they were pushing for an equal rights amendment to be added to the Constitution, which eventually didn't happen, but it was still an important goal. One of the leaders of this movement was Betty Friedan, a feminist, and her most important book is The Feminine Mystique. The Feminine Mystique is basically about the issues of like how difficult it is for middle class women to be at home, and how they lose ambition, and how they end up very often being depressed and so on because of this. Another important movement was the environmentalist movement. Well, this was a time when people realized that pollution is not just cutting out forests, but polluting the earth is also dangerous. And an important voice for this was a woman called Rachel Carson, who was a biologist who wrote a book called Silent Spring. Silent Spring was against DDT. DDT is a pesticide. A pesticide is a chemical that is used to kill insects, to protect plants. And she was against the DDT because she was afraid that, rightly so, that DDT is going to end up in the food chain. So, the insects die and the birds get these insects and eat them. And, the birds are also going to die because of this poison that was originally used to kill the insects. And then it's going to get into the water and people are also going to be infected and so on. The title of the book is Silent Spring because she's talking about a spring where the birds are not singing. Another important organization that was created at this time was Greenpeace. Greenpeace was originally green and peace, meaning that they were for the environment and for peace. They were mostly against nuclear testing, against detonating atomic bombs. And, eventually Greenpeace kind of became more and more only for the environment and not caring so much about peace or non-violence and so on. But in the beginning they were like this. Another important event is that a group that emerges, the New Left, who is basically like an intellectual movement on campuses and also in academia, basically questioning the looking at history from the perspective of working class and looking reevaluating the role of America in the world, maybe not always being so good and so on. But there were many other movements, including the movements of the Chicanos, the Mexican Americans, the movements of the Native Americans, and so on. So there were basically the 60s was a time when there were many movements, not just the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement, but all of these other movements. I think I even forgot to mention, the movements of the gay people. At that time, it was not LGBTQ, AIP plus so on, but it was just gay people who were fighting for equality and so on. Politics in the 1960s. So let's see how politics reacted to these changes. The first president in the 1960s was John F. Kennedy. Kennedy, who was a Democrat, was assassinated in 1963. And well, we still don't know why he was assassinated and how. Hopefully we're going to find out in a few years when the classification is over. There were many people who he ruffled the feathers of a lot of people. So just to say this. He was followed by Lyndon Johnson. He was also a Democrat. He was the vice president of Kennedy, and then he was elected in his own right after the end of Kennedy's first term, so in '64. Johnson also had a reform program. This was Great Society. The biggest steps in the Great Society were in civil rights. There were two Civil Rights Acts in '64 and '68 that were especially important because they basically banned and ended discrimination to a large extent. And another important was the Voting Rights Act in '65 that strengthened the already existing right of black people to vote, although it was ignored many times by the Southerners. But the Voting Rights Act was basically against this. And also in 65, the immigration reform was introduced, the quota system was put down, and a different type of immigration system was put up. Also, Johnson declared war on poverty, and one of the steps of the war on poverty was the Economic Opportunity Act. Unfortunately, the war on poverty was not exactly successful in every way. I mean, like, there are still poor people in the United States. It kind of, the result of it was that it shows that basically, just giving poor people money is not necessarily helping them in the long run. Also, there were healthcare reforms. Universal healthcare was still not introduced. I mean, it doesn't exist in the US today either. But Medicare was introduced to care for old people, and Medicaid was introduced to care for poor people who were not able to pay for medical costs or to buy health insurance. Johnson also introduced educational programs from primary school through secondary school until college. So evaluation, the programs were not very successful as a whole. Although the Civil Rights Act was successful, but many of these programs, especially the war on poverty, were very, very bureaucratic. A lot of the money was lost on setting up this office and that organization and so on, instead of going to the people who really needed it. So let's look at the 1960s and 1970s. Most people were really, fed up with this turmoil by the end of the 60s. There was violence on the streets, race riots in black neighborhoods like in Watts in Los Angeles. There were political assassinations, including John F. Kennedy, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Robert F. Kennedy, who was John F. Kennedy's brother and a possible contester to Nixon. So a lot of people had enough of this. This is why Richard Nixon could win the election in 1968 by his program Law and Order. And he claimed that the silent majority, the people who are maybe not out on the streets protesting, but they are, the majority of the country, were tired of violence, tired of turmoil, and they wanted peace and law and order. So Nixon introduced welfare reforms. Actually, a lot of people expected him to be very radically right, but he was actually kind of moderate Republican. He also established the Environmental Protection Agency that is still exists in the United States. But in the 1972 election campaign, he was involved in the Watergate scandal. What was this about? Well, the Watergate building is an office building in Washington, D.C. This is where the Democratic National Congress, the political opponents of Nixon, were having their campaign headquarters in the election campaign of 72. And there was a break-in into the Democratic National Convention's offices, and some people placed listening devices there. Well, it turned out that these people were actually connected to President Nixon's re-election campaign. Although Nixon claimed that he didn't know about this, and probably he really didn't, when he found out, he tried to stop the investigation so that there would not be a big scandal. But in reality, he just made matters even worse, because instead of just his subordinates being punished, it was him who got into real trouble. And in spite of the fact that he managed to come to peace in Vietnam, he had to resign over Watergate in 74. Impeachment was on the books. He would have been impeached and probably would have been convicted, but he decided to resign instead. Because this way, I mean, look, his presidency was over one day or the other, and he thought that if he resigns, then maybe he can just leave the office with dignity instead of the whole country and the whole media just talking about what he did for weeks or even months as the impeachment trial goes on, and then having to leave the office anyway. So he decided to leave. This way, his vice president, Ford, became the president, and Ford actually pardoned Nixon for all his crimes, because otherwise Nixon might have ended up in prison. So the 1970s was called the Me Decade, turning away from politics. I think it's pretty understandable that after the 60s with the Vietnam War and the Watergate scandal, people had enough of politics. So they were basically voting for pretty like gray politicians, meaning they were not that powerful. So Ford and Carter were the presidents in the 70s. So people were disillusioned with politics. They were looking inside rather. And there were many questions. Many people questioned the unifying myths of the United States. So they were looking at the country increasingly as a salad bowl instead of a melting pot. You know, like instead of looking at a big common American identity, people were discovering their roots, where they came from, where their family was from, and so on. So Ford and Carter, the Republican and the Democrats, were both outsiders. They were not part of the big party establishment. At the same time, there was a rise in conservatism. The new right appeared. So this was a movement, like an intellectual and political movement, not yet manifesting in electoral politics. That only happened under Reagan. Evangelical Christianity was on the rise. You know, this was a minor like bump in religiosity in the United States. The intellectual background of the new right was on the way. And there were neoconservatives, intellectuals, academics, and thinkers who were more conservative. And at the same time, in the 70s, was economically not a very good period. There were oil crisis in 73 and in 79 because of the Arab-Israeli wars. The US is supporting Israel, and the Arabic countries declared an oil embargo that really affected the US economy. So the 1980s. The 1980s was characterized by the presidency of Ronald Reagan, who was a Republican. Reagan basically was a product of this new right. I mean, he's been around. He used to be a Hollywood actor. He was very popular. He had a very good humor, and his enemies often underestimated him because of his perceived simplicity, but he was actually a smart guy. So what he was promoting were traditional values: God, family, and country. He was promoting conservatism and anti-communism. We are also witnessing the time of a religious revival with evangelical Christianity. What I show you here, this is the largest glass structure in the world when it was built. This is the Crystal Cathedral in Los Angeles. This is basically like a mega church. You know, this is a time when these televangelists were popular, and these mega churches were built, these new Protestant evangelical sects. In economics, Reagan was promoting free market solutions. They called this Reaganomics, with tax cuts and welfare cuts, but at the same time there was a rising national debt. And the United States also entered NAFTA, North American Free Trade Association. Yeah, I mentioned that for tax cuts, but welfare cuts. And at the end of the 1980s, the Soviet Union collapsed, which was an unexpected event that the Americans were not prepared for. So the 1990s was characterized by George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton. The US was number one economically and politically as well after the end of the Cold War. Now that the Soviet Union, their biggest enemy, was gone, and this is a time of globalization. You know, like American influence is spreading all over the world. The Americans are intervening everywhere in Iraq, in Yugoslavia, and so on. Also, we can witness the beginnings of the internet. This is the time when the internet appeared, first just as emails and the very simple websites. Also, multiculturalism became even more prominent than in the 1970s. People were discovering their roots, and also this was the rise of political correctness. The racial divide in the US was increasing because of this multiculturalism as well. A good example of this was the O.J. Simpson case. O.J. Simpson was he's alive, he was a football player, a black guy, who was accused of murdering his wife, and he was acquitted. He was found not guilty, and it's because the jury was majority black, and his lawyers managed to present this as if it was like a witch hunt against a black person. Whereas later it turned out that he did indeed kill his wife. So a lot of people were upset about this, that they thought that like he managed to only get away because he was black. And also there were several race riots in the United States at this time, in Los Angeles, in 94 and so on. So another thing that I want to mention is that Clinton was impeached because of a sex scandal because he had an affair with the intern Monica Lewinsky, like a young woman. Clinton was already like in his 40s or 50s. She was just like 20. So he was not impeached because of his the affair, but because he lied about it under oath to Congress, and the impeachment was unsuccessful. So the 2000 and 2010s are characterized first by the president of George W. Bush, who was a Republican. Quickly at the beginning of Bush's presidency, there were terrorist attacks of 9/11, so 2001, the 11th of September, terrorist attacks on the two World Trade Center towers and the Pentagon, and this really changed the United States probably forever. The USA Patriot Act was passed, which allows the government to spy on its own citizens, and the Department of Homeland Security was established. And actually it committed, along with the CIA and the National Security Establishment, they committed many civil rights abuses, which the famous whistleblower Edward Snowden uncovered in 2013 about how the government spies on its own citizens. An economic recession happened at the end of Bush's presidency and the beginning of Obama's in 2008 and 9. This led to even more government intervention into the economy, bailouts, which means that they gave money to big companies to stay afloat so that they would not go bankrupt. And this creates a moral hazard. What do I mean by this? These companies, big companies, would have gone bankrupt, and then the government gives them money so that they don't go bankrupt. Because what they say is that they want to preserve jobs, because these companies employ a lot of people. But the problem here is that if the businessmen see that if they would go bankrupt, the government is just going to give them money, they're going to take risks because, like, I can't fail. I'm too big to fail. The government is going to help me anyway. So this is a big problem even today. And this is bipartisan. Both parties did this. Obama did this as well. Obama, who was the first African-American president to be elected, Democrat from 2009 to 2017. So, his presidency was, it just ended. It didn't end that long ago. So we can talk about the rise of the social media. This is a time when the Facebook, Twitter, and so on became very important. But at the same time, the national debt is increasing. Like both the Republicans and the Democrats are just taking more and more and more loans. And this is also the beginning under Obama of, not beginning, but like the escalation of identity politics. So people, instead of looking at themselves as Americans, they're increasingly starting to see themselves as black or white, gay or straight, rural or urban, and so on. So the country is becoming more and more. So let's talk about what is going on in the United States today. As you all know, Donald J. Trump was elected as president in 2016 as a Republican. Trump was a complete political outsider. He was a businessman and a TV personality before. And his election was a complete backlash against political correctness and the coastal elites by the deplorables, basically who are the deplorables who Hillary Clinton, Trump's presidential opponent, called deplorables. They are basically the working class and middle class people who are very much not understood and disliked by the coastal elites. A lot of them felt that Washington and the politicians and the businessmen left them behind, and they were disillusioned with the political elites and the media, with the traditional elites of both the Republican and the Democratic Party and the traditional media. In many ways, Trump was a big protest against these people. What was Trump campaigning with? He was campaigning with Build a Wall, which is like anti-immigration policy, especially anti-illegal immigration, which he managed to partially accomplish. The building of the wall was not completed during his presidency, and the illegal immigration continued. And his slogan was America First, meaning that he wanted to put American interests first in foreign policy instead of fighting the foreign global wars and so on. At the same time, he was very much attacked by the establishment, by the media, as well as the politicians. He was accused of being Putin's puppet, which turned out to be a hoax. They accused him of having won because of Russian hackers. There was a long investigation, which turned up nothing, and there were 2 impeachments against him, both of which were, I think, complete failures. At the same time, there was a buildup of racial tensions. The movement that already started during the Obama years, Black Lives Matter, that was accusing the police of systematically acting against black people, was building up, and there were many riots on the American streets over the summer of 2020. This is, of course, partially also because of the whole society was traumatized by the COVID lockdowns, which in many ways restricted civil liberties. It is questionable whether these were constitutional or not, or how necessary some of these lockdowns and these limitations of liberties were. I think this is going to be the question for the future to determine, but they definitely contributed to the coming of another economic recession. We don't know yet how serious this is going to be. But I think mostly because of the handling of the COVID, or how they perceived it to be. Joseph R. Biden, who was Obama's vice president, was elected as president in 2020. He was inaugurated in 2021. This election was very much debated. Trump never conceded. He never acknowledged that Biden has defeated him. As of now, in the spring of 2021, there are still a couple of court cases going on with regards to whether the election was legal or not. A lot of people accused Biden of cheating. There is no evidence of this, or at least there is no evidence of large-scale voter fraud. At the same time, it is kind of difficult to prove. So I think the future is going to decide what we believe. But it's true that on the 6th of January 2021, there was a riot after a speech by Donald Trump in front of the Capitol, when the Electoral College, or the Congress was discussing the results of the Electoral College, and protesters broke into the Capitol, and several people died, all of them protesters, by the way. And this was in many ways used to justify backlash against Trump. What we can see in the US today is political polarization and tribalization that we haven't seen in a long time. On the one hand, we can see the alt-right, who are basically rejecting liberalism completely, and on the other hand, we can see the social justice warriors and the Antifa, or self-proclaimed anti-fascists. So the US is in a lot of turmoil. These two sides are pretty much against each other, and at the same time, we cannot neglect big tech's role in this. Facebook, Google, and Twitter, who have been very clearly biased, and Trump was banned from Twitter, banned from, I think, even from Facebook and most social media. Now, not even interviews with him can be put on YouTube, which is, I think, very strange and has definitely problems with regards to free speech. Meanwhile, where people are basically debating about these identity issues, there is a huge debt looming in the United States. And I think unless something is done about this, and if a lot of Joe Biden's plans get passed, the US is going to a very difficult decade economically. Okay, all right, guys, so that's it. See you in class, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Bye-bye.